Last time we spoke about the Sino-French War at sea. Admiral Courbet's Far East Squadron dealt a decisive crushing blow to the Fujian fleet at the Battle of Fuzhou. 9 ships were sunk with another 12 severely damaged, forcing the Qing to toss the Nyang fleet to meet the French menace. However, the corrupt nature of the Qing fleets led to a disastrous situation, and Admiral Wu of the Nanyang fleet would be quite a victim to it. He attempted to scare the French away, only to be attacked, then hunted down until his forces fled to Zhenhai Bay. The French erected a rice blockade trying to starve out their enemy, and it seemed the Qing Navy had nothing left to fight them off with. Meanwhile, the Tonkin campaign was still a bloodbath as the French forces tried to dislodge the Ching and Black Flags from the region. This episode is the Sino-French War Part 3, The Great Push out of Tonkin. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals is an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there I just released my 2-hour-long documentary on China's warlord era. And just a friendly reminder, I myself now have a Patreon account which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And over there you can find exclusive podcasts such as my comparison of the fentanyl crisis in North America and the opium wars of the 19th century, my piece on General Ishiwara Kanji, and an interview I did with Chuck Myers. Check it out, it would mean a lot to me. General Oscar spent considerable time thwarting guerrilla efforts against French outposts such as the ones at Tuen Kuang, Honghua, and Tuen Kuang. He dispatched Colonel Jacques Duchesne to neutralize Nuop to relieve the trapped garrison at Tuen Kuang. Duchesne managed to dislodge the Black Flag units there, but raids made by the Qing, Vietnamese, and other Black Flag units remained a constant nuisance. Tonkin was turning into a nightmare. The French needed quick victories before the Yunnan and Guangxi armies coming over the border into Vietnam could consolidate control over northern Tonkin. The French military high command began to debate the issue, and this led to the army minister, General Jules-Louis Lual, to order Oscar to launch a campaign against Langson. Langson was where the Guangxi army had established its main HQ. From Langson, the Guangxi army ambushed some French Foreign Legion forces east of Chu village at a place called Haoho. The legionnaires were able to fight their way out from a Chinese encirclement, but the casualties suffered were high. General Oscar tried to pursue the enemy, but they retreated to Dong Xang with ease. At this point, the Guangxi army knew their HQ at Langson was to be the next major target for a French offensive, so the Qing tried to gain a toehold in the Luknam Valley by sending 12,000 troops over a hill called Nuop. Atop the Nuop hill, the forces led by General Wang Dubang, a victor of the Bakli ambush, created a fortified camp. To support the men, Wang Dubang had his forces fan out, plundering all nearby villages for food supplies, thus earning the hatred of the local populace. This led to some farmers and villagers to come over to the French on December the 23rd, alerting them of the Guangxi army's presence atop Nuop. The news of 12,000 enemy units so close to their forward position at Chu threatened the French campaign soon about to launch against Langson in January, thus Oscar knew he had to neutralize them. Oscar took a force of 2,000 men, drawn from the 1st and 2nd Brigades of the Tonkinese Expeditionary Corps, and he began an offensive. Instead of directly marching east from Chu, Oscar decided to sweep the southern bank of the Luknam River to try and outflank the enemy's left flank. To make sure the Qing did not see this coming, he diverted a smaller force led by Chef du Bataillon, Ziguet, to approach directly from Chu. The main body departed Chu at 6 a.m. on January the 3rd, making an arduous trek, until they came across the northern bank of the Luknam River, but it unfortunately was higher in tide than expected. The crossing took the French nearly 3 hours, and in that time, Qing scouts saw them and they reported the incoming attack, thus the element of surprise was all but lost. Nonetheless, the French main body broke into 3 lines advancing towards the Qing left flank, which was within the Phongkat Valley and ready for a fight. The French began to skirmish with some Qing within some of the heavy bush, and had little trouble pushing them further back up the hill area. Soon the hills around Phongkat were cleared. Oscar believed the Qing forces were greatly demoralized and decided to seize Phongkat's town before midnight. They found the town abandoned, but the next morning came under heavy counterattacks, supported by artillery from a western fort. The Qing counterattacks were repelled, though at a great cost, and now Oscar pressed towards the village of Taitun, which held a hill with a fort. The Qing seemed to be in disarray, allowing for a French bayonet charge across their trench defenses there. By 11:15 a.m., the French had taken the camp and found Krupp field artillery pieces, large quantities of modern rifles, and war materials all abandoned. What became known as the Battle of Nuop amounted to 19 dead and 65 wounded for the French, while they claimed to have found over 600 dead Qing bodies and caused significantly higher casualties alongside it. The French soldiers scoured the battlefield for hours, using pistols to finish off wounded Qing soldiers, killing at least a dozen in this fashion. Oscar's victory was outstanding, given he was greatly outnumbered. French military commanders estimated he had won a battle with the odds of being 1 out of 10 for a French victory. Having neutralized Nuop, General Brière de Lille was now able to perform an offensive against the main Guangxi Army base at Langson. It was going to be a 10-day march just to get to the front line of Langson, a march where the troops were going to be carrying all of their equipment and provisions through heavy bush. Brière de Lille knew all too well how formidable such a trek would be, and waited until February, gathering as many coolies as he could muster to help. Throughout January, he got together 7,200 troops and 4,500 coolies. His Tonkinese expeditionary force held 2 brigades, the first led by Colonel Ange Joveninelli, and the second led by General du Brigade Oscar. On February the 3rd, they began their long trek, setting out from Chu, going over the Deovan Mountains to Caugnac without seeing enemy units. The next day saw the first action at Tehua. The 2nd Brigade, who were leading the march, found themselves face to face with a large fort. Oscar ordered the large fort to be seized as a threat in their campaign's timetable, and had his 3rd Regiment advance towards it. Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Gustave Herbinger led the 3rd Regiment of the 2nd Brigade, and he made an elaborate flanking maneuver that saw his forces exhausted and wasted quite valuable time. Oscar, greatly annoyed by this, then simply ordered the 3rd French Foreign Legion Battalion of the 4th Regiment to attack the fort head-on. The legionaries scrambled up the mountain paths and quickly seized the fort as Herbiger's men continued to trek towards it, looking like absolute fools in the process. The French casualties were 18 dead and 100 or so wounded, the heaviest the French had suffered in a single engagement up to this point in the war. The next day, the French assaulted an assortment of forts defending the Guangxi Army camps at Dong Xang and Hahua. The 1st Brigade hit the left side while the 2nd took the right side. French soldiers tossed dynamite onto garrison barracks roofs, fired upon Qing trenches, and unleashed hell with artillery to keep the enemy confused and dazed. On the 6th, Dong Xang was taken by the late afternoon, with very low casualties incurred for the French. Most of the Qing forces fled Dong Xang, heading through the Foubu Valley towards Langson. The loss of Dong Xang threatened the Guangxi Army's right wing, holding a position at Bacle, forcing them to pull back up the Mandarin Road to Tangmaui. Meanwhile at Dong Xang, the French resupplied, taking great stores from the Guangxi Army and continued their march by February the 11th, coming into contact with the enemy at Faofi. The Qing were easily dislodged from the village by Herbinger's regiment, but soon he was met with a heavy counterattack that forced General Oscar to pull up reserves to help him. On February the 12th, the French made it to Bacvier, just a few miles south of Langson. Giovanninelli's 1st Brigade was leading the way, and they took the brunt of the initial assault against the Qing lines of defense. The battle was fought in a thick fog, allowing the Qing forces to mount daring counterattacks that nearly repelled Giovanninelli's entire brigade. But the French were able to break through the center of the Qing defensive lines, isolating 2 wings who routed and began fleeing to Langson. The French received 30 deaths and 188 wounded for their efforts, the highest casualties of the campaign. The next day, the French forces entered Langson, as the Guang Army had abandoned its main HQ, only putting up rearguard actions as it did so. The Guang Army was falling back towards the Chinese border, but put up a strong defensive position in the small town of Dong Xang, within Tonkinese territory. By the way, for my American listeners, if you've ever watched Vietnam War movies or something, this is what you would call Dong Dang. But in Vietnamese, it actually sounds closer to Dong Xang. Honestly, probably makes this very confusing for more of you American listeners, as I'm pretty sure a lot of you are more familiar with these locations in Vietnam than, most of us in Canada or Europe for that matter. In the words of Briat de Lille about the Langson campaign, issued on February the 14th after capturing Langson, "You have hoisted the French flag above Langson. A Chinese army 10 times your numbers has had to recross the frontier in a complete rout, leaving in your hands its standards, its arms, and its ammunition. It has been forced to abandon to you or to disperse into the mountains the European equipment on which it had so heavily relied to block our march. Glory to all of you who successfully measured yourselves with this army in the actions of the 4th at Taihua, the 5th at Hahua, the 6th at Sangsang, the 9th at Zaoguao, the 11th at Vaovi, the 12th at Bacville, and the 13th at Langson, and chased it, despite its vigorous resistance, from the formidable positions which it occupied. Honor also to the officers charged with bringing up the food and ammunition trains. It is thanks to their devotion and indefatigable energy that you have been able to eat, and that our advances were not longer delayed." Now, while the Langson campaign was coming to an end, back over at the isolated outposts of Tainyuan, Honghua, and Tuen Kuang, things went to shit again. As soon as Tuen Kuang was relieved during the Battle of Nuop and the French had pulled out, the Yunnan Army and the Black Flags went right back to work attacking it. Tuen Kuang was given a new garrison, 630 men strong, led by Mac Edmund de Min. Liu Yongfu's ever-annoying Black Flag army, roughly 3,000 men strong at this point, were joined by a Yunnan army force of 9,000 men, led by Tang Xing. Tuen Kuang held a fortress not too large in size, lying on the western bank of the Clear River next to the town of Tuen Kuang. The town held also a citadel, barracks buildings, 300 yards of walls, and was surrounded by wooded hills. The wooded hills made it extremely difficult for the defending garrison units, as enemy snipers were able to fire from their cover. When Domin got the garrison job, he immediately went to work building a blockhouse on a hill 300 meters south of the town citadel, defended by some French Foreign Legionnaires. In early November, the Yunnan Army made its way down the Red River, advancing upon Tuen Kuang, building small encampments in villages as they did. By December, the Yunnan forces built 3 enormous fortified camps at Taiquan, Tailang, and Fuanbing, for the purpose of raising a siege of Tuen Kuang. The French only saw minor skirmishes up to this point. Then in January of 1885, the Ching and Black Flag forces began to squeeze the supply lines going to Tuen Kuang. On the 31st, the Yunnan Army began its initial attack, which was met with considerable losses. They would launch attacks again on the 10th of January and the 26th, but not meeting much success. Thus they began the age-old tradition of sapping to mine the walls of the fortress. By the 27th, their sappers had gone to work sapping towards the blockhouse. 3 days later, the French Foreign Legionnaires knew that they would be mined, so they abandoned the blockhouse and the Yunnan forces quickly seized it. The Qing used the blockhouse as an advanced position to set up artillery to hit the French fortress, bombarding them nearly every day. The French were met with cannon, mortar, and rifle fire from all sides of their position. Domin posted his best snipers along the walls, trying to inflict casualties upon the attackers, and occasionally he used his own artillery to hit the enemy. However, the Qing snipers using those wooden hills were quite impossible to hit, but they in turn were not as successful hitting the French. The Qing continued to sap around the French walls, hoping to cause a large breach, but the French were well prepared for this. French counter-sappers broke into the Qing tunnels on the 11th of February, causing an underground revolver fight. Must have been terrifying. The French tried to flood the tunnel, but by the night of the 12th, the Qing exploded mines under a part of the fort's walls. Luckily for the French, the mine was weakened by the flooding, not resulting in a large enough explosion to cause a breach. The next day, another mine was exploded, and this one did cause a 50-foot breach in the southwest part of the walls of the citadel. The The Qing surged for the breach, and they were met by French foreign legionnaires who kept them at bay. By the 17th, the Qing brought their artillery closer up to dislodge the legionnaires, who were forced to pull back from their foxholes. On the 22nd, the Qing delivered a major assault after they exploded a mine in another part of the walls, acting as a feint to get the defenders to leave the 50-foot breach. The Qing surged again into the breach, but were repelled by a countercharge led personally by Dimin. Then, a third mine was exploded, taking down 60 yards of wall, signaling a decisive moment. Hundreds of Qing forces surged out of their siege trenches towards the large breaches, met by a rapid French rifle fire. As terrifying as it was for the outnumbered French in their trenches, they managed to keep the Qing at bay. The breaches were too large. It seemed all was hopeless for the defenders. But word was received that Langson had just been seized. General Brière de Lille left 3,000 men to garrison Langson, and he personally led the 1st Brigade of Giovanninelli back to Hanoi and raced upriver to relieve Tuen Kuang. As he made his way, additional forces from Honghua joined him, giving him a total strength of 3,400 men. The French knew the Black Flags and Yunnan Army forces had established yet again strong encampments at Yuak, this time in a gorge near the village of Huamang. Brière de Lille took the men directly through the Yuak Gorge, forcing the Qing to mount a defense in Huamang. Liu Yongfu took command of the combined forces, 6,000 strong, manning 3 lines of trenches, with their flanks resting on the clear river to the east and a rough mountain to the west. It was a well-positioned defense, forcing the French to attack directly from the front. On the morning of March the 2nd, the French approached what looked like to be deserted trenches. There was no signs of the enemy. Giovanninelli sent a platoon over to check it out, and they were met with a volley at point-blank range, killing and wounding 30 men. Seeing the enemy, Giovanninelli opened up his artillery upon the left flank and sent a battalion forward to assault it. The Qing responded by exploding a mine right in front of their trenches, devastating an Algerian unit, leading the assault to failing. Another assault was formed, but once again they came within fire range of the Qing, were overpowered, and then sent reeling back. Giovanninelli redeployed his artillery to hit another section of the first trench lines, and then tossed a third assault which broke through a section of the forward trenches. This prompted Liu Yongfu to launch a counterattack against the French left flank, to try and distract them from advancing anymore, but it was driven off with heavy losses. The casualties had mounted up heavily for both sides, and by the nighttime it was unknown whether the French would have enough power to break through during the morning. Brière de Lille and Giovanninelli were shocked by the enemy's resistance, and in the words of one Lieutenant Hugo, "The general-in-chief was sitting behind a bank, anxious, his head in his hands, surrounded by his staff, perhaps wondering whether he would have to retreat. Colonel Giovanninelli, who valued the life of the humblest soldier as dearly as his own, was pale and shaken as he watched the lines of blood-stained stretchers fill past him, and he kept exclaiming in a strangled voice, 'My children, my poor children.' The bullets whistled insistently in the close air, and the groans of the wounded men lying in the rose bushes, inside the bamboo groves, and against the sides of the enemy works rose ever more distinctly." That night, Liu Yongfu ordered his forces to make a counterattack to try and take back the lost front-line trenches. The French responded with a bayonet charge, leading to a night brawl of hand-to-hand fighting until the Qing were driven off. The next day, Giovanninelli was forced to bring up all of the reserves, and he ordered an entire brigade assault against the stretch of forward trench lines, still held by the enemy. The French began a trot, then went into a full-blown charge, expecting to be met with a hailstorm of volley fire, but instead, they found the trenches deserted. Liu Yongfu had pulled out after the failed night attack, leaving the way to Tuen Kuang clear. It had been a bloody fight. The French had 76 deaths and 408 wounded, the highest casualty rate and largest loss of life in a single day's fighting for the entire war. 6 officers were dead, 21 wounded. Countless men would be tossed onto gunboats only to die in hospitals in Depkao and Tikao. It was a decisive victory as Liu Yongfu and the Yunnan Army lifted their siege of Tuen Kuang, withdrawing further west. Brière de Lille entered the brutalized outposts of March the 3rd, and as told to us by Captain Jean-François Alphonse Lecomte, "We approached the fortress. At the head of a group of officers, we saw a captain with a long white beard, who was flourishing his cane and dancing an impromptu jig. The first man he met in the relief column was a bugler. He threw his arms around him. Then he embraced the second bugler. The band tried to keep its dignity, but to no avail. He then abandoned the buglers and fell on the neck of the first drummer. For a moment, the drummer stood between him and the object of his affections, but eventually he managed to plant 2 loud kisses on the drummer's cheeks. Then he made for the general-in-chief. There was a sudden hush, as when an orchestra falls silent at the end of a dance. He recovered himself, solemnly clicked his heels and saluted General Brière de Lille. "We recognize Captain Dubois de Lille." "Good afternoon, Captain. How are you? We're delighted to see you." "Indeed, me too, especially as I only just escaped being killed this morning." The men of Tuen Kuang had 50 dead and 224 wounded during their defense of the town. It was estimated by the French that the Black Flag and Yunnan forces suffered 1,000 deaths and 2,000 wounded during the siege and battle for Nuop. The fight to save Tuen Kuang would be the defining image of the Sino-French War and place second only to the Battle of Cameroon in 1863 for the role and battle honors of the French Foreign Legion. Now, when Brière de Lille grabbed the 1st Brigade to relieve Tuen Kuang, he left the 2nd Brigade of Oscar to occupy Langson, but also to press forward to rid Tonkinese soil of the Guang Army. General Oscar had 2,900 men, and he knew the enemy had left a last toehold at Dong Xang. Again, despite the fact I'm a Canadian, I have seen my fair share of American movies about the war in Vietnam. That place would be known as Dong Xang to Americans. That toehold turned out to be an extremely formidable one. They established a position on a 300-meter limestone plateau rising west of the Mandarin Road and just a bit north of Dong Xang, leading to what is known as the Gate of China. The Gate of China was a border gate. Think of a less grand Great Wall of China that sits atop a large sheer cliff. It could only be climbed from its western approach, and it was very well defended with artillery positions on its summit. The Guang Army's position along the hills east of the Mandarin Road were covered by numerous elevated infantry and artillery positions, making it extremely difficult to attack head-on. For a force to seize this, they would need to assault the limestone massif, and to do that, they would first have to seize the town of Dong Xang. The town itself was the weakest point of the defense for the Guang Army. It held low-lying buildings. There were also forts in the villages to the west of Dongtian, Tatke, and Foubu. Oscar led the men out of Langson on February the 23rd, going up the Mandarin Road. Along the way, his vanguard reached the village of Tamlan and the hamlet of Banving. There they engaged a small group of Guangxi units who were patrolling the area. They quickly fled to warn their forces at Dong Xang of the incoming attack. The French forces had to fight their way up the rest of the Mandarin Road, being assaulted on their left and right flanks. The Guangxi Army's artillery for once held a distinct advantage because of the cliff positions, and they took a toll upon the French. This forced the French to assault multiple hills along the way to neutralize the artillery pieces until they fell upon the western town forts. Upon seeing the defenses of the Guangxi Army, Oscar knew that they had to get them off the limestone massif. To attack that, though, Dong Xang had to be seized, but to take that without losing half of his men, he needed to neutralize the western forts first. Oscar began bombarding the forts with his artillery from a very long range. Once the forts were silenced, he turned his artillery upon the hills east of the Mandarin Road. The idea was simple. He was trying to edge in with his artillery while avoiding as much of the enemies as possible. By 3 p.m., the western forts and their defenders seemed sufficiently battered, so Oscar ordered Lieutenant Colonel Abigat to seize them. The Guangxi defenders, upon seeing the charging French, left the forts, opening the path to Dong Xang. The French began bombarding the town buildings, lighting them ablaze and leaving just a small amount of the Guangxi units trying to skirmish within them. Admiral ordered his men to assault the town, and they began to advance over a kilometer of open ground where the Guangxi Army artillery atop the summit could fire down upon them without mercy. As the French marched towards the outskirts of the town, they were met with intense artillery fire, and the men hesitated. Their officers leapt from their horses to push the men out of the firing range, and this drove them into a charge of the blazing town. The soldiers charged wildly and disorderly through the town, trying to get at the few Chinese skirmishers, as their officers barked orders at them, but it was to no avail as the French soldiers were running for their damn lives under intense artillery fire and now the heat of the fire from the town itself. The Guangxi skirmishers, scared out of their mind, fled the town, and the French officers eventually regained their men's composure. From here, Miguel ordered his men to march forward up the slopes towards the massif. They were met with intense artillery fire, and the men began to fall as they scrambled up the slopes as fast as they possibly could. Despite mounting casualties, the French continued until they hit the most forward trench positions, and only when an entire French battalion tossed its strength did the Guangxi defenders give away. The Guangxi army's right wing fell back to Tatke as the French continued towards the summit of the limestone massif. They reached the summit, finally gaining the vantage point, and began to fire down upon the enemy near the Mandarin Road. Now all that remained was an enemy position northeast of Dong Xang, which blocked the advance up the Mandarin Road. The French seized a hill due north of Faubourg and began to use their artillery on it to hit the enemy. Seeing the right flank of the enemy fleeing to Tatke, Oscar ordered 2 forward companies to pursue them, while others seized the village of Quai and finally the Gate of China. A French battalion reached the Gate of China, which was protected by 2 flanking forts and trenches along the slopes of its neighboring hills. However, all the forces allocated to these defensive positions had been moved forward at the offset of the battle, and when they ran back, the French gave them little time to rally. Their lines quickly broke, allowing legionnaires to occupy the Gate of China with relative ease. The rest of the brigade gradually took Quai, the hills east of the Mandarin Road, and all met up at the Gate of China as the Guangxi army fled to its homeland. Believe it or not, the French claimed to have lost only 9 men dead and nearly 50 wounded during this chaotic battle. The Guangxi army casualties are unknown, but were probably in the hundreds. After clearing the Qing forces from Tonkin territory, the French literally blew up the Gate of China on February the 25th. The Qing customs building, the Tonkin-Guangxi border, they were all destroyed. Oscar placed a wooden placard on the ruins. Inscribed in Chinese were these words: "It is not stone walls that protect frontiers, but the faithful execution of treaties." I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, over at YouTube. Over there, I have just released a 2-hour-long documentary on China's warlord era. And next is a film review of Grave of the Fireflies. Real tearjerker. Also, just a friendly reminder, I now myself have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And over there, you can get early access to all my content, polls to vote on what I do next, exclusive podcasts only found over there, and other goodies. Check it out, it would mean a lot to me. The French had kicked the Qing forces finally out of Tonkin, so the war must be over, right? One would think so. But there were still some surprises to occur in the undeclared Sino-French War of 1884 to 1885.